BioWare has had a rough few years. There was huge uproar over the ending of Mass Effect 3, and then they made Mass Effect Andromeda, which, while it has its fans, was generally not very well received. And then Anthem, which was this failed Destiny-like live service game that's been all but abandoned by the studio. And now we have the return of Dragon Age, with Dragon Age the Veilguard. It really does seem like this is the last chance for BioWare, and I'm worried that if it doesn't deliver, EA might gut them. In this video, we'll discuss how BioWare got to this point, where the gaming industry is right now, and why BioWare really needs the next Dragon Age to be a success in order to survive. So first, let's talk about how we got here. I love Mass Effect. Those first two games are still some of my favourite games of all time. However, since Mass Effect 3, I've been disappointed with the series. I was one of those people that was fairly unhappy with the ending, to say the least. BioWare did try to alleviate the outcry by releasing the extended cut DLC, where they changed some of the bizarre decisions towards the end of the game and they provided some extra scenes to explain things a bit more, but for many people, myself included, the damage was already done. Mass Effect suddenly felt tainted to some extent. You know, it was the ending of that trilogy and you thought that choices that you had made throughout the trilogy would have some kind of impact at the end of the trilogy to cap everything off. And those kind of final 10 minutes with the Star Child thing and all the other weird decisions towards the end of the game just really rubbed me the wrong way. Looking at Mass Effect now, the next Mass Effect likely depends on whether or not Dragon Age the Veilguard is a success. And I can't see BioWare being able to attempt to make another entirely single-player, story-driven Mass Effect game that continues the series if this new Dragon Age doesn't do so well. Honestly, my hopes for a new Mass Effect lie with this new upcoming RPG called Exodus, which is being developed by many ex-BioWare developers and looks like it would be a spiritual successor to Mass Effect and kind of fill that gap that BioWare's left. I've actually made a separate video on Exodus, which I've linked in the description below, and I'd recommend watching it if, like me, you're a bit pessimistic about the future of Mass Effect, especially considering how the trilogy ended and how Andromeda worked out. Speaking of which, Mass Effect Andromeda was the last Mass Effect game that we had, and sadly was not received very well.
So, are you mad, Ryder?
The game was in development for about 5 years, but most of the development was done in the final 18 months or so, supposedly. That's according to a big article that Jason Schreier did way back when he worked at Kotaku. He did a big expose on the history of the development behind Mass Effect Andromeda, and that's really, really interesting. I'd recommend you go and have a look at that if you want to know more about what happened with that game. Mass Effect Andromeda came from BioWare Montreal, which was a sort of like B-team studio at BioWare, which prior to Andromeda, they had only really worked on Mass Effect DLCs, like the Mass Effect 3 Omega expansion. And Andromeda released in 2017, and I remember being really excited at the time, but like many, I was left disappointed overall. There are some good parts of the game. I think the combat's probably the best in the series. I think most people agree on that. And the Nomad was actually okay. It was a nice improvement over the Mako. But the general reception around the game was not very good. It's the worst received game in the series. Andromeda takes place in a completely different galaxy, as the name suggests. It's set in the Andromeda galaxy, and it's therefore removed from the setting of the original Mass Effect trilogy. This made perfect sense, as it meant that BioWare could really set this game apart, and it could be removed from the baggage of how the original trilogy ended and the backlash associated with it. It could be a fresh start for the series and an opportunity to establish lots of new lore across many new worlds. It was an almost blank canvas. The initial setup was interesting, with a secretly funded project to transport various races to this new galaxy with the aim of colonising planets and exploring planets deemed to be golden worlds. You play as a Pathfinder tasked with exploring these worlds. I really liked this as it felt like the focus was on exploration and it was very reminiscent of the first Mass Effect game. However, the story soon became a bit too familiar, in my opinion. Andromeda's main story revolved around finding the remnants of this ancient civilization, and then this new evil alien race appeared and they were as the kind of main antagonists, and they were fairly forgettable and one-dimensional from what I remember. Generally, the writing felt like a big step down from previous games, in my opinion. The characters were dull and uninteresting, the dialogue was poor, and the way you interact and talk with others felt rather simplified. And this is a problem that I had with Mass Effect 3 as well, where dialogue choices and RPG mechanics felt like they had become really diluted. And some of the dialogue as well was just kind of like, I know it's almost like cliche to say now, everybody says this about lots of things, but it had that kind of like MCU quippy kind of nature to it. There were certain characters, I think there's a character called Liam who if you take him on missions, he's just cracking jokes every 5 seconds, and it just feels really out of place and tonally kind of odd. So the reception to Mass Effect Andromeda was so poor that it led BioWare to effectively put Mass Effect on ice. They stated that the series would be on a hiatus until further notice. Since then, of course, another Mass Effect game has been announced, but it's likely very many years away, with its continued development likely dependent on whether or not this new Dragon Age game is a success. And there's a lot more I could mention about Mass Effect Andromeda and Mass Effect 3, but that's for another video. I remember paying close attention to the fallout around the release of Anthem. I think I played an open beta or something, or some kind of test thing that they had before the game came out, but I didn't have the pleasure of playing the final release. I did, however, binge reviews and impressions and videos on YouTube from people like Angry Joe and others at the time. And while it was obviously, it was sad to see what was happening to BioWare in this studio that I grew up loving, making Mass Effect and Knights of the Old Republic, seeing the kind of ridiculous level of fallout around Anthem at the time online was kind of pretty entertaining, to be honest. Similarly to Mass Effect Andromeda, Anthem reviewed pretty badly. As of this video, it has a 59 on Metacritic for critic reviews and a 4.0 for user reviews. I remember the game, it certainly looked fantastic. It had some amazing looking vistas and environments, and the javelins were fun to use and maneuver. But many complained about the repetitive mission design, boring loot, bugs and server issues, and a poor crafting system. I think in many ways Anthem signified the death of BioWare. The studio that made Baldur's Gate and Knights of the Old Republic was now chasing live service trends in a loot-based online game, with much less of an emphasis on story and just generally lacking in content. Considering all of this, BioWare is now in a position where their next game really needs to do well, and hopefully at least to some extent restore their once great reputation. They've had a series of misses now, and it's been 5 years since Anthem came out in 2019, and that was their last release. The industry as a whole isn't in a great place at the moment either. It's been sad to see how many job cuts and studio closures there have been across the gaming industry in the last couple of years. Very recently there's been a lot of cuts going on. More recently, Bungie had a second wave of layoffs following their acquisition by Sony, and other PlayStation studios like Naughty Dog and Insomniac also suffered layoffs, while PlayStation London was completely shut down. But EA, who have quite a history of buying and closing studios, and they're no stranger to cutting costs at the expense of its employees, and they have also recently cut loads of jobs. In February of this year, EA laid off 670 employees, cutting about 5% of their workforce. They cancelled a Star Wars first-person shooter that was in development at Respawn Entertainment. They also completely closed down a studio called Ridgeline Games. Ridgeline is a relatively new studio, having formed in 2021, and they were working on a single-player Battlefield game. Some of their developers have been absorbed into Ripple Effect though, who are a co-developer or support studio of sorts on Battlefield, who work alongside DICE. With the pressure on for their next game, and considering the way that the industry is right now, and EA's track record with this kind of thing, I think that BioWare are particularly vulnerable to cuts if Dragon Age the Veilguard misses the mark. They haven't had a hit game in years, and their last 2 games have been some of the worst received games that they've ever released. It's also worth noting that they themselves have already suffered some job cuts recently. Around 50 employees were let go just over a year ago in August 2023, and this included veteran employees and senior writing staff, including the lead writer behind Baldur's Gate 1 and 2 and the writer of the first 3 Dragon Age games. So not the best start. So I think it's fair to say that initial reactions to Dragon Age the Veilguard were a bit mixed, to say the least. And I'm kind of looking at this as a bit of an outsider, to be honest. I'm a long-term BioWare fan, always have been, but I'm not a huge Dragon Age fan, and that's only because I just haven't really played them. For some reason I just kind of missed it over the years, it just kind of went past me. I know I did play a bit of Dragon Age Origins when I was younger, but I don't think I ever finished it, and I don't really remember it that well. And I don't know why I've let this happen. It certainly seems like my kind of game, and I'll definitely be playing through the earlier games in the series very soon when I get the chance. But, even I was kind of a bit, I guess, shocked when the Veilguard was first properly revealed, because I think people were kind of shocked generally with how the game seemed to have this kind of lighter tone and a change in its art direction. However, with the release date trailer and some of the footage that has released since, I'm a bit more positive about the game. When the release date trailer came out, it looked a bit more promising and more so what I would have expected from a new Dragon Age release. They seem to have focused back on that darker tone again. And then a few weeks after that trailer, there has been more footage that has come out, and EA also hosted an event for content creators to go and play the game for quite a few hours. Just the fact that EA and BioWare are even willing to do this, I think is a really, really good sign. A really positive sign for the game. They must have had a certain amount of confidence in the Veilguard to be willing to show it off like that. To let people come and play the game all day. I think from what I understand, that's just how it worked. People just turned up in the morning and were just able to just play the game and do what they want in the game for 7 or 8 hours or something. And when you look at the previews that came out from this event, they mostly appear to be fairly positive. I've watched a few of them now, and I think the consensus that I've seen is that there's a decent amount of player choice, and the feelings around it are fairly positive. I'd recommend watching Luke Stevens' preview in particular, because that was quite good. However, with all that said, I'm still not a huge fan of the art style, and I don't really understand the change at all, really. I think Dragon Age has always had a good look to it that conveyed a certain seriousness. It was gritty and harsh, and I think that reflected the tone. However, in the Veilguard, they've gone for this more cartoony style with lots of colour, which I'm not really a huge fan of. The character models in particular just look kind of weird. The proportions are wrong or something, there's something off about them, and I can't quite place it, but I'm just not a huge fan of the character designs in this game. There's just something odd about them. So I didn't even play Inquisition. As I said, don't have that much experience with the series myself, but I remember thinking about playing Inquisition, but I heard mixed things about it. Apparently it was kind of full of MMO style fetch quests, and I wasn't really interested in that. Let me know in the comments if I'm wrong about that though, by the way, and if I should go and give Inquisition a try, because I'm definitely going to play Origins and probably Dragon Age 2 soon. But yeah, is Inquisition still worth playing as well? Because I did hear mixed things. But with any BioWare game, just like with the Mass Effect games and previous Dragon Age games, you would expect to be able to carry over choices that you had made in those previous games. However, with the Veilguard, you can only select 3 choices to be carried over, which I think is quite disappointing. It's a lot less than even previous Dragon Age games, like from Dragon Age Origins to Dragon Age 2, I think you could do a full character import. And I know people are kind of really annoyed about that. I'm also not thrilled about the facial animations. I don't think they look terrible or bad, but I don't think they look great either, really. BioWare struggled with this for years now. Even after Andromeda, you would think that this would be an area of focus for them, but apparently not. They're still using the Frostbite engine, which is notoriously difficult for games like this. Apparently, for first-person shooter games it's fine and works well in Battlefield or Star Wars Battlefront, but for RPGs it's not so great. If you look at the animations in something like Baldur's Gate 3 from last year, or Cyberpunk 2077, or even The Witcher 3, which came out I think 9 years ago now or something, which is crazy. I feel like the character animations in general, but especially the facial animations, are honestly still maybe even a bit better than what BioWare's putting out now. I think especially Baldur's Gate 3, which came out last year, the character animations in that game are actually really quite good. The combat system has also had huge changes. It's more of a kind of, casual action combat system now. It kind of goes back on that previous system in the series, which was a bit more tactical and was sort of similar to something like Baldur's Gate. It's very much more of an action game now. They've also reduced your squad size from 4 to 3, and they've removed the ability to control your companions. And there's also lots of loot, lots of gear. I do think that what they're doing with item progression and gear progression, those is kind of decent, and how you can upgrade your weapons. It does very much seem like something you would expect from an RPG, so that's a good thing. Having said all of that, I think when you think back on previous BioWare games from years and years ago, like my favourites, Knights of the Old Republic and Mass Effect 1 and 2, you think of great storytelling, great characters, player freedom, reactivity in the game world, choices that had weight. These are all things that need to be included in single player BioWare games and should be the absolute priority of Dragon Age: The Veilguard. And honestly, if they get those things right, then I think a lot of the other noise around the game doesn't really matter. Things like the animations or art style or combat, really they're all secondary to what this game should be, is kind of storytelling and RPG mechanics. Having said that, I feel like we're not really off to a good start with this though, considering the BioWare are only carrying across 3 choices from Inquisition, So already that means that your choices from the previous game are kind of out of the window. And as I said, I didn't play Inquisition, but if I did, and I was a huge fan of the series, I'd probably be pissed at this. And it could be emblematic of their approach to player choice in general in the Veilguard. I hope that that's not the case, but you would think that if they did care that much about player freedom and player choice, that they would make carrying over choices from previous games a priority, even if it was in a small way. I've seen a lot of the discourse around this online, and I know a lot of fans consider this to be kind of a betrayal, and I understand what they mean. Those old BioWare games just had something about them that you couldn't really find anywhere else, and they're still some of my favourite games of all time. Like every video game studio, the BioWare today is very different to the BioWare from 10 or 15 years ago, but they're still trying to make single-player, story-driven games, they're still trying to make RPGs. Hopefully it actually pays off this time. After Anthem and Andromeda, BioWare really need a win, and I honestly think that they'll be in real trouble if they don't stick the landing this time. So I'm really hoping that Dragon Age the Veilguard somehow manages to be a great game. Let me know what you think below. What does Dragon Age have to do to be a success other than hitting those notes on the story like I mentioned? As I said, I'm not the biggest Dragon Age fan in the world. I'm not overly familiar with the series. So if you are, I'd be interested to know what your take is and how you're feeling about the game. When I have had a look at like the Dragon Age subreddit, I mean, especially following that last trailer, things seem to have kind of changed and sentiment seems to be a lot better. And people do seem to be excited for the game. So hopefully, by accounts of real Dragon Age fans, the game is promising enough where hopefully it's looking like it's going to tick the right boxes. But let me know what you think though, and what would kind of make this a good Dragon Age game. What do you want BioWare to do with this game? Thank you for watching. Please do subscribe. I make content about single player games, narrative driven games, so if that's your kind of thing, then please do subscribe. And if you enjoyed the video and you're excited for the next Dragon Age, please leave a like. Thank you for watching.